In my previous lectures, we discussed how law evolved, custom, then legislation, and then we discussed in my last lecture who should be making laws, and we agreed on the House of Representatives, and we discussed all this. Now, another issue is important for us is how does a judge or how does a natural person decide the rule that is applicable on a problem? If you may recall, I've talked numerous times before that we want our students at the JUC to have the reputation that they are good businessmen. And in order to be a good businessman, if you are living in Egypt, you must be able to understand the rules, the legal rules, and understand how to apply them. So we discussed who is responsible for making the rules. Now let us discuss how do you find the solution? How do you find the rule that includes the legal rule and the punishment for any legal problem? Or, as we sometimes like to call it, that contains the solution. How do you find the solution? How does the judge decide the solution? Does the judge read the file and decide what he thinks is right? What is he obliged to do? And what he must do to reach the correct punishment or the correct solution for the legal problem? This is a very important issue. Why is it an important issue? Because the rules themselves, the law itself tells us how to interpret the law. Let us assume that a judge has a legal problem in front of him, and he wants to find the legal rule to be applied, or the solution, or the punishment. Where would you look? Logically, he would look at the legislations passed by Parliament. Fair enough. Now, Parliament was aware from day one that no matter how many laws or legislations Parliament enacts, it will still not cover all the legal problems that, or the problems or the legal problems that may arise in the community. And they were aware, no matter how many laws they make, there still be new problems they were not aware of and did not think of a solution, all problems that they did not make a solution for. So therefore, our Parliament, to solve this ongoing problem, in Article 1 of our Civil Code, clearly says the following, which is my lecture today. All my lecture today will be based on interpreting Article 1 of the Civil Code. What does Article 1 says? It says a judge, if he has a problem, must first look at legislation, and if he doesn't find solution, he goes to custom. If he doesn't find solution, he goes to principle of Islamic law, and if he doesn't find solution, he goes to natural justice and rules of equity. And this is what I'm going to explain today. Let us take a straightforward example. First, when a judge is faced with a problem, the first thing he does, he opens the law books. He opens the book of legislation. What is the book of legislation? It is a book that includes all the legislations passed by the Egyptian Parliament, by the Egyptian House of Representatives, to see whether there is a solution for the problem at hand or not. And if there is a solution or a punishment, he applies it and looks no further. Then, what happens if he does not find the solution of the legislation? He looks at customs. Why is the second step looking at customs? Because customs was the step before legislation. So we started first with custom, and then we went to legislation, and I told you from day one that customs still covers other areas not covered by legislation. Again, law is common sense, and this is really what I want to drive into your minds. This year, it is the year of understanding. You must understand first before you can memorize, because if you understand, the information we give you will be useful for you, and answering the exam, in case you forget will also be useful, will also be easier. So number one, we look at legislation. The judge, to decide the matter, looks at legislation. Easy. Book of legislation has all the legislation passed by Parliament. He finds a solution, he stops there and he applies it. He doesn't find the solution, he goes to the next step of custom, which are the rules made of by the community to rule certain actions. Remember, we passed a long time explaining what custom is. And it may cover other areas not covered by legislation. Then, let's assume he finds a solution in custom. That's the end of it. He applies custom. But custom is applied in this case as part of legislation. It is not applied as custom. In the sense, Article 1 of the Civil Code really tells the judge, if you do not find the solution in legislation, you are supposed to apply custom as if it was legislation. So it is applied in this case as if it was legislation, covering the areas not covered by legislation. Again, custom is man-made. It could cover certain solutions not covered by legislation. But it is still possible that we may have a scenario that the judge looks at legislation, finds no solution, looks at custom, finds no solution. The judge is still under obligation to solve the problem. So where does he look? Principles of Islamic law. He's not looking at Sharia law, he's looking at principles of Islamic law. Again, common sense. This country has a majority of Muslims for more than 700 or 800 years, maybe even 1,000. What are we applying here? We are applying principles of Islamic law. If you are a Muslim, or even if you are other religions living in Egypt, there is no doubt that the principles of Islamic law is something that you became aware of, and you may or may not have applied. So common sense dictates no solution legislation, we apply custom. No solution custom, we apply principles of Islamic law and not Islamic Sharia. And I will explain in a bit what is the difference between principle Islamic law and Islamic law, because Sharia is called Islamic law. Again, judge is faced with a problem, looks at legislation, book of legislation, no solution, looks at custom, no solution, goes to principle of Islamic law, and if he finds a solution, he applies it. But again, remember, principles of Islamic law in this case are applied under Article 1 of the Civil Code as if they are legislation. They are there to cover a problem in legislation. So when the judge applies principle of Islamic law, it is by order of legislation, so you consider principle of Islamic law in this specific problem as the legislation applicable. Again, we must remember, a judge must decide. A judge does not have the luxury of applying a judgment. The judge does not have the luxury of deciding or not deciding. Any legal problem presented to him, he must decide the punishment, he must decide the solution. So, finds no under Article 1, he's obliged to look at legislation. No solution, he goes to custom. No solution in custom, he goes to principle Islamic law. Although principle Islamic law are quite wide and could have a wide application, still the legislator, the House of Representatives thought there may be situations where the solution of the problem is not possible under principle Islamic law. So we take a fourth example, a problem, judge looks at legislation, book of legislation, the laws passed by the House of Representatives, no solution. Looks at custom, doesn't find a solution. Looks at general principle of Islamic law, he doesn't find a solution. Then we needed a way for him to solve the problem that is flexible and can solve any problem if said problem is not solved by legislation, custom, or principle of Islamic law. What is the catch-all? What are the rules that can solve any problem? The rules of natural justice and rules of equity. القانون الطبيعي وقواعد العدالة. What does rules of equity? Rules of fairness. Is it fair when you lend someone not to be repaid? No, it must be repaid. So rules of fairness. Natural justice. Again, it's the type of equity. Natural justice. If I do something bad to you, I should compensate you. These are the rules of fairness and natural justice. These can encompass any problem. So really the legislation, Article 1 of the Civil Code, encompasses a system by which it can solve any problem. First legislation, second custom, then general principle of Islamic law, and the last one that covers every situation possible, natural justice and rules of equity. Natural justice, قواعد العدالة, and rules of equity gives the judge a tremendous amount of flexibility in solving any problem that is faced. If he does not find a solution in legislation, then goes to custom, then no solution goes to general principle of Islamic law and doesn't find a solution. And again, the rules of natural justice and the rules of equity are applied as if they are legislation. Why are they applied as if they are legislation? Because Article 1 of the Civil Code tells you so. Tells you if you don't find a solution in legislation, go to custom. Tells the judge if you don't find a solution in legislation, go to custom. If you don't find a solution in custom, go to principles of Islamic law. If you don't find a solution, go to natural justice and rule of equity and apply. When you apply each one of them, you're applying it as if it is the legislation, because Article 1 makes them the legislation applicable. If there is no legislation to cover, if there is no law made by Parliament to cover a problem, we go to custom and we apply custom as if it is legislation because of Article 1 of the Civil Code that orders the judge to apply it as such. If you do not find the solution in custom, you go to principle of Islamic law and apply the principle of Islamic law as legislation because Article 1 of the Civil Code orders the judge to so. If you do not find the solution in principle of Islamic law, you apply the rules of natural justice and the rules of equity, again, as the legislation applicable because Article 1 orders you to do so. What does that really mean? It means that the rules of natural justice are only applied to legislation if a problem doesn't have a solution in legislation or custom or principle of Islamic law. And custom is only applied, that part of the custom is only applied as legislation. This rule of the custom, rule of custom has 100 rules. This rule of custom is only applied if it is applicable, if there is no solution in legislation. And principle of Islamic law, that principle of Islamic law is only applied as legislation if there is no solution for the problem in legislation or custom. And natural justice and rules of equity are applicable as legislation or for a specific problem whenever there is no legislation to cover it, or custom, or principles of Islamic law, or principles of Islamic law. The next issue we have to cover, what is really the difference between Islamic law, Islamic religion, Islamic law, and principles of Islamic law. Remember, under Article 1, what is applied after legislation and custom is principle of Islamic law, not Islamic law. What is Islamic law? What is Islamic religion? These are specific orders to solve certain problems in a certain way. It says, if you steal, I will cut your hand. This is the rule of Islamic law. This is the rule of Islamic religion. Principles of Islamic law, you're not supposed to take something that does not belong to you. That's a principle. But the rule under Islamic law is to cut the hand. Which one do we apply after legislation and custom? We apply principle of Islamic law, which is you should not take something that does not belong to you. Okay, what are the formal sources of Islamic law? They are whatever is written in the Quran, the Holy Quran, or written in the speeches of our Prophet Muhammad. This is the only formal source of Islamic law. And principles of Islamic law are the principles enshrined in the Islamic law that does not include the specific rules that must be applied. Question: is Islamic law itself a applied in Egypt in any way? Islamic law. General principle of Islamic law, we said after legislation and custom. The question we're going to deal with now is Islamic law applied in any form or shape here in Egypt? The answer is yes. Islamic law is applied as legislation only for personal status matters like marriage and divorce. So if the judge has a problem relating to personal status matter, أحوال شخصية, he is obliged to apply Islamic law on Muslims as legislation. And this is really the beauty of the Islamic religion comes into play. In personal status matter, we apply legislation as legislation, Islamic law on Muslims. And we apply Christian law on Christians of the same sect and the same religion. People of different religions, we apply to them Islamic law because that has been the law of the land for a very long time. What are we saying here? Islamic law from day one, and today even our own parliament has passed legislation to this effect. What does this legislation says? It says if a judge is faced with a personal status matter, he applies as legislation Islamic law on Muslims. Okay. Now, if I have, and he applies the religion on two people of the same sect and religion. So, if I'm a Christian Orthodox married to a Christian Orthodox lady, then we apply Christian Orthodox law on personal status matter like marriage, divorce, marriage and divorce. If personal status that I'm talking about here is only marriage and divorce. As far as inheritance, there is one law for inheritance in Egypt, which is Islamic law. So all Egyptians, in matters of inheritance, we apply on them, the parliament decided that we apply on them the rules of inheritance of Islamic law. But if we are dealing with a personal status matter like marriage or divorce, as we said, Muslims, we apply on them Islamic law. People of the same sect and religion, we apply to them the law of their sect and religion. What does sect and religion mean? Every religion, like Islam, for example, we have Islam, and we have the Sunnis and the Shias. So what is the religion? Islam. What is the sect? Sunni or Shia. Christianity, we have the Christian Orthodox, we have the Christian Copts, we have the Christian Protestant, and we have other sects. So what happens if a Christian Orthodox marries another Christian Orthodox? What is the legislation applicable to them? It is the Christian Orthodox law on marriage and divorce. If a Copt is married, if a Christian Copt, Christian religion, Copt sect, is married to another Christian Copt, then what law we apply to them on marriage and divorce as legislation is ordered by Parliament? We apply to them Christian Copt law. If a Christian Catholic is married to a Christian Catholic, what do we apply to them? We apply on them Christian Catholic law on marriage and divorce. Now, what happens if a Christian Copt is married to a Christian Catholic? Same religion, yes. Same sect, no. So in this way, we apply to them Islamic law. I have to emphasize, if two Jews are married, two Jews of the same sect and religion, we apply to them Jewish law. I want to emphasize, I believe it's one of the greatest things of Islamic religion, that it allowed the application of marriage and divorce of other religions on the peoples of those religions, although the country was under Islamic law, which is no more so. But that tradition of applying marriage, the law of the same sect and religion, in personal status matter, marriage and divorce, the same religion, is something started during the time when Egypt was part of the Islamic Empire. So, to finalize, general principle of Islamic law as applied as a source, as a formal source, what is a formal means? Obligatory. It is applied as a formal source of legislation. Again, to conclude, formal means he doesn't have any leeway to do otherwise. So a judge, when he looks at what are the formal sources for the judge, Article 1 says legislation. If he doesn't find a solution, he goes to custom. Custom in this case is a formal source of legislation. That's why I said it is applied as legislation. If there is no solution in this specific matter, it's applied as legislation. If there is no solution, we go to principle Islamic law. In this specific problem, principles of Islamic law are a formal source obligatory to the judge and are applied as a formal source as obligatory on the judge. And in this specific case, that general principle of Islamic law solving this problem is legislation for this problem. And then we go to natural justice and rules of equity. If I have no solution in legislation, no solution in custom, no solution general principle of Islamic law, natural justice and rules of equity are applied as a formal source of legislation. It is applied as legislation as a formal source, which again I emphasize one more, which means the judge must apply it in this case if he does not find a solution in number 1, legislation, number 2, custom, and number 3, general principle of Islamic law, and number 4, natural justice and equity. I have just finished speaking in the previous slide on how the general principle of Islamic law and Islamic law are applied in Egypt. That being said, I think we must look at the bigger picture. Look at why Islamic law is applied on person status matters in Egypt and for non-Muslims in some cases where they are of different sect and religion, and also understand why did Article 1 of the Civil Code serve as a third formal source of legislation after legislation and custom, general principles of Islam. That requires us first to look at the different religions. If you look at Christianity and Islam and Judaism, you will realize that Islamic law is different than Christianity in the sense it is not only a religion, but is a religion and state, deen wa dawla. It combines the principle of religion and morals with the principles of legislation and law. What am I saying? Really, Islamic religion. I'm talking here about Islamic religion. Islamic religion combines two very important actions. It tells us how to live and how to solve our problems and what are the punishments for certain, what are the legal rules for certain problems that include the punishment, while at the same time telling us about our relationship with God. While Christianity deals only with the relationship with God. As a result, this is, for example, let's take a very basic, laws of inheritance. Why don't I apply on the laws of inheritance Christian law? Because Christian law does not include any rules of relating to inheritance. While Islamic law, because it's both a religion and a state, it includes rules relating to inheritance. And the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are the source of Sharia, includes rules that govern every aspect of our life. Inheritance, trade, sales contracts, penalties, Islamic law, Islamic law in reality, or Islamic religion contains an Islamic law system that covers everything. Covers our relationship with each other, with each other, the punishment for what we do to each other, and also it covers our relationship with God. And this Islamic law has been applied in a lot of Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, where it is the total law of the land, it has no legislation. Any problem, they apply on it only Islamic law. And in the next slide, I will explain to you how do they go about finding the right rules if you are a country that applies only Islamic law and not legislation. Before I close, I must remind you, as I said before, that in Egypt, the only aspect that we apply Islamic law on everybody to is inheritance, while marriage and divorce, we apply Islamic law on Muslims and on people of different sects and religion. But people of the same sect and religion, Christianity, like a Christian Catholic, a Christian Catholic, and a Christian Catholic, we apply to them in marriage and divorce the laws of their own law religion, Catholic. Previous slide, we discussed how Islamic law is both law of the state, it's both a religion and a state, and we also discussed that Islamic law is based on Islamic religion. I want to elaborate further on this point by saying that where would a judge, if I'm in Saudi Arabia, or if I'm a judge in Egypt and dealing with inheritance, where would I find the formal sources, the obligatory sources of Islamic law? The obligatory sources of Islamic law are two. Number one, the Holy Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. These are purely divine in nature, plus something else which also formal, which is Islamic doctrine. What is Islamic doctrine? It is the interpretation of the great sheikhs of Islam, of their interpretation of the rules of the Holy Quran and of Sayyid Muhammad. These are mandatory. An example is Al-Shafi'iyya, Al-Hanifiyya, Ibn Hanbal, Abu Hanifa. These are all great Islamic sheikhs that interpret the Quran, and they are formal source of Islamic law. What does formal mean? Obligatory. So if a judge is looking into personal status matter in Egypt, inheritance for example, or inheritance, and he has to apply Islamic law, where does he look? He looks in the Holy Quran, he looks in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are obligatory, and he also looks at the writings of the great sheikhs of their interpretation of the rules of the Quran, which is also obligatory for him to apply. So to summarize, what are the formal sources of Islamic law? The formal source of Islamic law is the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Islamic doctrine written by great sheikhs of Islam like the Shafi'iyya, Abu Hanifa. These are the ones that explain the rules, and if a judge is looking at a personal settled matter whether he has to apply Islamic law, or at an inheritance where he has always to apply Islamic law, he looks at them as formal and obligatory sources. Now, let us focus. We have spoken about Islamic law. Let us try and see what happened, what is the influence of Islamic law and religions in general on the Egyptian law in modern. Egypt was invaded by the Muslims, and Islamic law was the only law of the land. So since Islamic law, since the Muslims ruled, Arab Muslims ruled Egypt, Islamic law was the only source of legislation. The only exception was the only source of legislation. In sense, any problem arising, the judge at the time would look at the Holy Quran, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Islamic doctrine, and apply them as formal source of Islamic law. This continued in Egypt for more than 400 years. Then Egypt became ruled by Muhammad Ali, who was very important in the development that happened in Egypt at the time. When Muhammad Ali became in power, was started to be in power, Islamic law was applied with exception on all Muslims, but it did not apply on non-Muslims on the issues relating to personal status matters. Exactly in a fashion similar to what I said about what is applied today. When Muhammad Ali took office, Islamic law was applied on all matters except personal status matters. And personal status matters, we applied the religions of those of non-Muslims, which is the rule we said today. What is that rule? Let me remind you. If a judge in Egypt today is first with an inheritance, on any Egyptian, whether Coptic, Jewish, or Muslim, he applies Islamic law. If he is faced with a marriage or divorce matter, personal status matter, he applies the same, if they are of the same religion and sect, their same religion and sect rules. And if I am not of the same religion and sect, he applies Islamic law. Now, Muhammad Ali felt, whether rightly or wrongly at the time, that Islamic law could not fully adapt to the change in civilization. Remember, Muhammad Ali came into power when we started moving from a totally agricultural economy into an industry. So Muhammad Ali felt that if he applies different rules, that may encourage the industrialization and the development of Egypt. And accordingly, he started copying some of the French rules in relation to trade. In such that matters trading to trade, he stopped applying Islamic law and started applying certain parts of the French law, in order to encourage industry and to encourage, in his mind, the development. You have also to remember that after Muhammad Ali died, Egypt went through a very difficult stage, especially at the time of Ismail Pasha, one of his grandchildren. What was the problem Egypt was facing? Egypt was technically part of the Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire. The Turkish Ottoman Empire became very weak. It started allowing countries like England and France to intervene and have power in its countries. Egypt was one of the governorates, one of the countries ruled by the Ottoman Empire. As part of the problems happening in the Ottoman Empire, French, English, Italian, all of them started having great influence. And they started trying to adapt, trying to enshrine, trying to get the Egyptians to think that foreigners are better than them. Mental occupation. And the first thing they started doing was putting pressure on Ismail Pasha and the Ottoman Empire that all problems that involve foreigners would not go to Egyptian courts, would go to the embassies to be solved by the embassy. So if an Egyptian quarrels with an Italian, he goes to the embassy and the embassy issues a judgment that is enforced on the Egyptian. And of course, the Italian embassy, if a problem involving Italian, the British, if it's a problem involving the British, the American, if it's a problem involving the American, are always rule in favor of their citizens. This was really occupation. So if an Italian hits an Egyptian by car, he doesn't go to his embassy. Sorry, he doesn't go to an Egyptian court. He goes to his embassy, to a court in his embassy. It's called consular courts, المحاكم القنصلية. And that court most likely decides something in his favor. This was another source of occupation. So although Egypt technically was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, in reality, because of the weakness of the Ottoman Empire, these foreign countries like England, France, Germany started having their own courts in Egypt in their own embassies. So, at the time, if a problem involves an Egyptian or foreigner, they go to the consular embassies. If a problem between Egyptians, they go to an Egyptian court. So if a problem, again, relating to a foreigner and an Egyptian, they go to the consular, to the embassy, where it has what we call محاكم القنصلية, consular court, that most likely, of course, always in more favor of the foreigner. Remember, these are cycles, in the sense that the cycle was at the time the Ottoman Empire became weaker, these countries became stronger, but also the cycle starts shifting the other way. The sentiment in the world became that a foreigner cannot, in a country, have a higher authority than the citizens of that country. And of course, as part of that, of course, if an Italian would hit an Egyptian, would not go to jail, of course, because the consular embassy would never order him to go to jail except in extreme cases. So what was happening? The trend was more power for the foreigners. That trend started to change in the whole world, not in Egypt alone. The Egyptians started taking more control over their destiny. The influence of the foreigners became less. The British became more involved, more interested, not in running day-to-day Egypt, but only in protecting the Suez Canal and controlling it. And as a result, and also the Egyptians became very upset with the idea of the consular courts, and a new system was established. There was a new court was established. An Egyptian court was established, was a mixed court. What محاكم مختلطة. That mixed court, if a problem between an Egyptian and foreigner, he would go to the mixed court. If a problem between a mixed Egyptian court, it was part of the Ministry of Justice in Egypt, not part of the embassy of a foreign country. And if a problem between an Egyptian and Egyptian, he would go to national courts. These mixed courts had judges from Egypt and judges from other countries, but again, it was, at the end of the day, an Egyptian court. And then, again, national sentiment became stronger, and the mixed court were cancelled, and every problem, whether involving an Egyptian with a foreigner or two Egyptians, would go to the national Egyptian courts, and the mixed courts were cancelled. Now, let's go back to the development. Ismail Pasha came in power. At the time, certain French rules were applied for trade. What happened at the time? That more and more laws became passed instead of Islamic law. Ismail Pasha started for the first time getting the commercial laws of other countries. The Islamic law doesn't have a civil code, of course. He got the civil law of France and became applicable in Egypt. As time went by, as the country moved forward, with the pretext that these foreign laws are more adapted to the industrialization of Egypt or the development of Egypt, Islamic law application became less and less until it reached what it reached today, in the sense that Islamic law is only applied on inheritance and divorce and personal status matter, marriage and divorce between non-Muslims or non-Muslims of different religion and sect. What are we concluding here? We are concluding that with the passage of time, Islamic law became less and less applied, and we started adapting laws of foreign countries, as if they were Egyptian legislation. I will summarize to you and add what is the position of principles of Islamic law in Egypt today, and what is also the position of Islamic law and general principles of Islamic law. We have already said that several times that under Article 1 of the Civil Code, principles of Islamic law are a formal second source of legislation according to Article 1 of the Civil Code. We already said a judge is ordered as a formal source obligatory to apply legislation. If he doesn't find a solution, he applies custom. Custom in this case is considered part as legislation for that specific problem, and if assumed there is no solution in custom, he applies general principles of Islamic law, and for this specific problem, these general principles of Islamic law are considered legislation. And then I've also said, again several times, that rules of Islamic law and Christianity are legislation, are the primary source, not only the primary source, it is the only source with regard to personal status matters. And to explain that further, I said, if a judge is faced with an inheritance problem for any Egyptian, irrespective of his religion, he applies Islamic law, and I already said that what are the source of Islamic law? Quran, the sayings of the great Quran, the sayings of our Prophet Muhammad, and the Islamic doctrine. And we said, what is the Islamic doctrine? It is the writings of the Sheikh interpreting the mandatory rules, or interpreting the rules of Islamic law on the conduct of the people. Now, question, is Christianity also legislation in Egypt? Yes, Christianity is legislation in Egypt if the persons are of the same sect and religion in marriage and divorce, personal status matters. So if a Christian Copt is married, a Christian Copt is married to a Christian Copt, then we apply to them Christianity, Christian law, which is, it's not a Christian law, it's applied to them Christian religion. We apply to them Christian religion to their problem, and again, so, and this is one of the things I feel about the greatness of Islam, that from day one, it allowed the application of other religions on people living under Islamic rule. What am I going to introduce as for the first time now is what is the position of general principles of Islamic law other than what I have said. Remember, a judge's order. Let's talk about the judge. If a judge is faced with a problem, he has to apply general principles of Islamic law as a formal source after legislation and custom. And if he faces a personal status matter, he must apply Islamic law. And if he's married, if he is faced with a personal status matter, he must apply Islamic law on Egyptians and Christian law on people of and the other religions on the people of the same sect and religion. And if they are not, they apply Islamic law on them. Not general principles of Islamic law. This is an order to whom? This is an order to the judge in solving the problem. But you cannot underestimate the value of general principle of Islamic law. It is enshrined in the heads of Egyptians. We have, this country has been a Muslim country for at least a long time, for at least 700 or 800 years, for a long time. So not only is Islamic law, not only we have a large number of Muslims, but also the principles of Islamic law are shared among the people in the community, even with different sects and religions. So, who makes the law? Applies the law the judges, we understood that. But who makes the law? It is the House of Representatives. So the Article 2 of our Constitution tells the House of Representatives that a primary source of legislation is general principles of Islamic law. What does that mean? It tells the House of Representatives when you are making a new law, not applying it in the case of the judge, but when you are making a new law, you must look at the general principles of Islamic law, or the principle of Islamic law, and adopt them when you are making that law. So for us, Islamic law and general principles of Islamic law come twice. For the judges and the courts who apply the law, it is a source of legislation after Article 1 of the Civil Code, after legislation and custom. Islamic law, not principles of Islamic law, is legislation in inheritance and legislation for personal status matter between Egyptians or Egyptians of different sects and religion. And if they are of the same sect and religion, we apply their own religion to them. So if a Christian Copt is married to a Christian Copt, then we apply to them their own religion. The problem now is much higher. This is after the law is made. But because general principles of Islamic law are so important for a country like Egypt, Article 2 of our Constitution orders the House of Representatives, whenever they're making a new law or amending a previous law, to use as a primary source, Masdar Ra'isi, a primary source of legislation, principles of Islamic law. What means use as a primary source? Means take it into consideration. Look at it when you're trying to find a legal rule to solve a certain problem. This slide, I will focus on the principles of Islamic law as a secondary source of legislation. The order to the judges to apply the principles of Islamic law is restricted to, is only in case of the judge does not find a solution in legislation. So under Article 1 of the Civil Code, he goes to custom, and then he goes after, if he doesn't find a solution in custom, he goes to principles of Islamic law. And also principles of Islamic law, the House of Representatives is ordered, when making a law under Article 2 of the Constitution, to adapt principles of Islamic law when making a new legislation or law or amending a legislation law. Now, what does principles of Islamic law mean? We spoke about this before. Islamic law says, I must cut your hand. Is that a principle of Islamic law or rule of Islamic law? It is a rule of Islamic law. Is it applied in this case? No. What is the principle of Islamic law that is applied in this case? You will not take something that does not belong to you. So, what is applied in these two situations as a source of legislation after legislation and custom, and by the judge, as applied by the judge, and the order to the House of Representatives to apply the principle of Islamic law as a primary source of legislation under Article 2 of the Constitution, is the principles of Islamic law, not the rules of Islamic law. Like you will not do to others what they want them to do, what you may not want them to do to you. This is a principle. But if you steal, I cut your hand, that is a rule. If you kill, we cut your head, that is a rule. So we have to remember here that we are only talking about principles of Islamic law when it is applied as legislation, if there is no solution, legislation and custom under Article 1, and when by the judge, and when it's used as a primary source of legislation by the House of Representatives. Again, we are only talking about the principles of Islamic law. I am sorry to have bored you by repeating the same thing many times. As you may recall, the repetition is always for two reasons. Repetition, one, it is something that most likely will be tested in the exam. Whether it's a question or whether as a multiple choice or nothing, I don't know, but it is something that across the years has come back over and over again, and it is something difficult to understand, so that's why I took time out to explain it in detail. And that is why now I'm going to repeat something that you've already heard. It is not new, but I want you to focus on it because it is important. It is important for the exam, and I believe it's also important for your life as a businessman later on. Again, I am going to focus on principles of Islamic law. Let's close our eyes and think. When are principles of Islamic law applied in Egypt? Principles of Islamic law are applied in Egypt by judges and by the House of Representatives. When are principles of Islamic law, not Islamic law, principles of Islamic law applied by a judge as legislation, as a formal source of legislation? It is applied if the judge is faced with a problem that he does not find the solution for it in legislation, and he does not find the solution for it in custom. He applies principles of Islamic law on this specific problem as legislation. Let's take, for example, a realistic problem. For a long time, before the new laws came by, marriage in Egypt was not codified until 1930s. Marriage in Egypt was not codified. There was no legislation in Egypt organizing marriage, where it's to be registered, not registered, all this, there was nothing. So if a judge and divorce, no rules for marriage and divorce. So in 1930s, when a judge was faced with a problem relating to marriage or divorce of Muslims, what he would do, number one, he would look at legislation, find no solution. He would look at custom, of course, custom, no solution. And he would look at the general principles of Islamic law to try and find a problem for the solution. What are the principles of Islamic law with regard to marriage? That it is a contract. So the judge looks at the marriage as a contract as such. So for us to remember, principles of Islamic. Whenever I use general principles of Islamic law, I also mean principles of Islamic law. Principles of Islamic law are applied by judges as a secondary source, as a formal source, obligatory source of legislation. If you find no solution under Article 1 of the Civil Code, if he doesn't find the solution in legislation and no solution in custom, it applies general principles of Islamic law as legislation in this specific matter. And whom is it applied by? We're talking here about the application of the judge, because the court is the one that has to solve the problem and look at the law. Who else applies general principles of law? General principles of Islamic law? It is under Article 2 of our Constitution, the House of Representatives. Our House of Representatives, our Parliament is ordered, if they are making a new law or amending a previous law, to take into consideration principles of Islamic law, to consider the impact, the effect of the principles of Islamic law on that new legislation. So for example, if Parliament thinking of a law where if you give a loan you don't repay it, principles of Islamic law requires that if you take something you must return it. So as a result, they must look at the principle of Islamic law and see whether it would allow them to do something like this or not. So again, order to judges for the 10th time under Article 1 of the Civil Code. It ordered judges when faced with a problem to apply legislation as a formal source obligatory. No solution applies custom. No solution applies general principles of Islamic law as an obligatory source, and it becomes applied as legislation of this specific problem. Number two, principles of Islamic law are applied by the House of Representatives. When the House of Representatives is making a law, the judge uses this when the judge has to decide on a matter. But also it is so important that the House of Representatives, in making a new law or in amending an old law, must look at the principles of Islamic law and take them into consideration. To close this issue completely, when do we apply Islamic law? Not principle of Islamic law. We apply Islamic law on all Egyptians in inheritance matters. And we apply Islamic law on marriage and divorce of Muslims, and marriage of divorce of non-Muslims of different sects and religion. But people of the same sect and religion, like the Christian Catholic married to a Christian Catholic, we apply to them Christian law as part of the Egyptian legislation. And when Islamic law is applied on inheritance, it is applied as legislation. This is the legislation of the land for inheritance. Christian law is the legislation of the land. If a Christian Coptic law is the law of the land, if a Christian Copt is married to a Christian Copt, and Islamic law is the law of the legislation of the land if a non-Muslim is married to a non-Muslim, both of them are of the same religion or different sects, or they are also of different religions. So if two Egyptians of totally different religions are married, we would apply to their marriage and divorce Islamic law. And on inheritance matter, and on inheritance matters, we apply Islamic law on all Egyptians.